Hi, my name is Dr. Chris Gustafson, and I'd like to welcome you to our first episode of Virtue Stands in the Middle. It's a program about the Christian virtues as well as how to apply those virtues to our lives. A few months ago, I told a friend of mine that I was going to write a book on the Christian virtues. She looked at me as though I was going to write a book on the molecular composition of rubber. And I think at one level she was right, because so many works, so many talks on the virtues are so abstract that they have little relevance to our daily lives. At the same time, she was dead wrong. She was dead wrong because the virtues are at the center of the human drama. Let's take the example of marriage. Think about how many marriages are destroyed because of lust, irresponsible spending habits, or just plain narcissism. Lust, for example, could take the form of pornography or adultery, and its opposite is the virtue of sexual integration or chastity. It's the lack of the virtue of chastity that destroys so many marriages. Many marriages are also destroyed by irresponsible spending habits. The virtue of liberality is that virtue that addresses a kind of comprehensive financial management plan for our lives. We keep track of, in a prudent way, of what comes in and what goes out and how to manage our money, similar to generosity. Without liberality, we're going to fall into irresponsible spending habits. Finally, think about narcissism. Oftentimes it breeds a type of contempt by one or both spouses for each other. It's this narcissism or excessive self-focus that destroys countless marriages. The opposite, the virtue that opposes this is humility. I'm not the center of the universe. And humility allows us to realize our own importance, but also see the importance of others and also of God. These three vices and their opposite virtues, they're at the heart. They're at the heart of the human drama. I'd like to do three things today. First of all, I'd like to speak about virtue and vice, what they mean, what it is. Secondly, I'd like to speak about the name of our program, Virtue Stands in the Middle. And then finally, I'd like to talk a little bit about the virtues in art, how artists have portrayed the virtues in history. Okay, let's talk about virtue and vice. Here we see a beautiful picture entitled Hercules at the Crossroads by Pompeo Battoni. The woman dressed in battle attire at the left is a personification of virtue. The woman seated almost in Hercules' arms is a personification of vice. The center person, of course, is Hercules. And in this picture, in some ways, Hercules represents all of us. We all have to make a decision as to whether we will exercise either virtue or vice. So what is a virtue? In its simplest form, virtue means a good habit. And vice means a bad habit. The word virtue is derived from the Latin word vir, which means man in Latin, and it refers to strength. In English, we have the word virility. So a virtue is a type of strength to do good. A virtue is a good pattern of behavior. We call someone who exercises virtue a virtuous person. A virtuous person. At the same time, we have vice. So a vice is a pattern of evil. It's a pattern of sin. Just because someone commits one sin does not mean they have the vice of that sin. Rather, vice is a pattern of sin. It's a pattern of evil. So Hercules, representing all of us, he must choose. In this picture, he's being faced with a decision. Should he lead a virtuous life, or should he lead an easier life of vice, taking the easy way out in his life actions? So we've already seen 3 vices and 3 virtues. We've seen in the example of marriage, lust being the vice. It takes forms of pornography, adultery, and all the rest. And it's opposing virtue or good pattern of behavior, namely chastity or sexual integration. The second vice that we looked at is irresponsible spending habits, racking up huge credit card debt. The opposite virtue is liberality, which is similar to generosity, but it's broader. It includes all of our spending habits, all of the whole world of prudent financial management. And finally, we looked at the vice of narcissism, ultimately pride, excessive self-focus. Its opposite virtue is humility. Humility that has a realistic view of ourselves, of others, of God. It has a realistic view of who we are in the universe. So while the demands of virtue are inevitably more difficult than the ease with which we can fall into vicious habits or habits rooted in vice, ultimately virtue is the solution to so many of the problems faced by people in marriage, but just by life in general. Let's spend a few moments talking about the name of this program, namely Virtue Stands in the Middle. The name comes from an ancient Roman or classical maxim attributed to the Roman poet Horace that reads, "In medio stat virtus." Virtue stands in the middle. What does that mean? Here we have a beautiful picture of fortitude or courage by Sandro Botticelli. We could call her Lady Fortitude as well. And we can employ this picture as an example of what does the phrase virtue stand in the middle signify. We typically think of courage as being on the opposite end of a pole from the vice of cowardice. Someone is either courageous or a coward. That's typically how we conceptualize virtues in our minds. But actually this isn't true. Actually, Lady Fortitude or courage stands between 2 different vices. She stands between 2 extremes, an excess and a deficit. So all the virtues, they stand between 2 different vices, both an excess, going too far, and a deficit, not going far enough. So the deficit for the virtue of courage would be cowardice, not having the moral strength to move forward, not having the guts to do what needs to be done. At the same time, there's an extreme with regards to an excess of courage or an excess of this virtue. The excess of this virtue would be being foolhardy, attacking a dangerous situation when there's no hope of success, rushing in when you will most certainly die, This would not be courageous. This would just be stupid. Aristotle compares the practice of virtue to the practice of archery. We must aim for that bullseye, that sweet spot, and anywhere else we miss the mark. Anywhere else we land somewhere in vice. We land somewhere off of what we should be doing. Finally, I'd like to talk a little bit about the virtues in art. The classical artists, they frequently, almost always, depicted the virtues as beautiful women who who held or were near some symbol of the virtue that they portrayed. Let's take a look at a famous picture. Here we see The Seven Virtues by Francesco dello Scheggia. It's a beautiful classical depiction of the seven primary virtues, all depicted as beautiful women. We've already seen the first on the far left, namely Lady Fortitude. She has her battle attire because to be courage means to be ready with a certain type of strength. But we also see her six sisters. So from left to right, we have Lady Fortitude, then Lady Justice, who we often encounter when we enter into a courtroom or a law office. Then we see Charity with her burning heart. In the middle is Lady Faith. She holds a crucifix or a cross and the Blessed Sacrament. We then see Lady Hope. She's praying, similar to an angel. Then next in line, we see Lady Prudence. She has a mirror because prudence knows itself, but it's also as wise as a serpent. So she holds a serpent in one hand. And then finally at the end, we see Lady Temperance. She holds a pitcher pouring water into a receptacle. This is the classical image for Lady Temperance. In the 15th century, people would have been familiar with these seven beautiful ladies. Well, now I think maybe only Lady Justice, the second one from the left, is vaguely familiar to people in our culture. The purpose of our program is to reintroduce people to not only these seven primary virtues, but in fact to all the virtues. In his Summa Theologica, his summary of theology, the great medieval theologian St. Thomas Aquinas listed more than 40 virtues. And in fact, for every area of human activity with some sort of moral content, there's a virtue that accompanies it. This is probably enough information for an introductory program. I'd like to thank you for watching and stay tuned for our next edition of Virtue Stands in the Middle.